Okay, let's get started. Welcome to everyone.
Bernard,
My name is Bernard
can I do a
Hoogman.
sound
I'm a
test?
professor here at the Robert Schuman Centre. You all know why you're here. This is the Xth edition, and I actually should have done my homework, which I didn't. So I don't know what edition of the World Trade Forum this is. Do you know, Joe?
I'm trying to do math here, I'm not sure.
Anyway, we've been doing this for quite a while. It's a joint venture with the University of Bern at the World Trade Institute. And essentially the idea behind the original thought was to take a conference that had been run for a long time by the World Trade Institute and make it broader, open it up to have more economists, more political scientists, more practitioners. And I think we've been quite successful, even if I say so myself, in terms of doing so. If you look at the current program, if you look at the people who are in the room and who are going to be online. The theme of the conference is non-economic objectives in international trade. The motivation behind picking that particular theme will not be particularly come as a surprise to all of you in this room. We've seen a lot of shift in terms of the use of unilateral trade policies and more generally just conditioning trade on non-economic types of goals, right? And increasingly, traditionally, those have been related to labor standards, worker protection. Then, of course, we have environment, and more recently, we have national security, economic security, policy autonomy. It's, this comes in different flavors. And then the implications of that is we need to de-risk our supply chains, we need to think about potential weaponization of trade and so forth. So the conference is essentially kind of organized around that general theme. And as all the World Trade Forum conferences have been, it's a mix of practitioners and people who are doing research on this. Right? So one of the objectives of the conference was to build a bridge between the academic community working on these types of topics and people who are in the trenches and actually dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. Right, and some of the speakers in the first plenary panel are people who have either been there or are still there and can speak to the real-world dimensions of what we're talking about as academics. from a more distant picture. So I'm not going to take too much of your time. We want to start on time. What I want to do is just thank all of the partners of this conference. And as you'll see on the back of the program, for those of you who have a physical program, there are a large number of logos on the back of the program. And that doesn't so much reflect contributions in terms of money, the usual sponsor type of approach, but that really reflects partnerships, right? And I think many of the people who are here, many of the people who have been working together on these various topics, that network effect is really one of the things we're very keen to support and to continue to pursue. So I'm not going to go run down the list, but you'll see a number of international organizations there, including the OECD, the WTO, UNCTAD, but also research institutes, think tanks like IDOS, like the International Growth Centre. So we have a mix of institutions and people who come at this from very different perspectives, either very micro or much more strategic, trade policy focused, which I think really enriches the discussion. So with that, let me turn it over to Joe, and then we can get started.
Thanks, Bernard. Yep, so just to repeat, Bernard, welcome. I'm the Bernard's sidekick in this thing from the World Trade Institute. We're based in Bern. The conference, as you know, moves back and forth. And the WTI dates back to the early years of the WTO, in essence. It was set up as an institute that is focused specifically on trade and economic governance, both capacity building and research. It's been around, I guess 99 was the founding year, so we've been doing this for decades at this point. Bernard and I moved at about the same time. Bernard came here, I moved to Bern, and we had this conference with, if you're a native English speaker, it's a delightful acronym, right? The name of the conference was not adopted by a native English speaker. And if you have the coffee cup from the 2020 virtual conference, it's 2020 WTF, right? The year of the start of the COVID stuff. It's a collector's item now, so if you're interested, we may auction some off later, but they're delightful things to have. Or to give people grief if they don't have one. I don't think Petros has one yet. So this thing, I was looking as Bernard's talking, I think we're approaching 20 years. We're not quite there yet. And when Bernard and I took over, we decided this was a chance to take what had been basically an academic conference focused on producing a policy book into something more broad, right? Focusing on, we kept the academic angle, we'll talk about that in a minute, but also then getting a bit more, providing a forum to have a bit more discussion in these panel formats on policy issues from year to year. This has included energy trade, digital trade, non-tariff measures, non-trade objectives, or non-economic objectives this time. Something on, even things on like the trade aspects of the monetary system, so that from year to year, the topics have varied based essentially on what is going on in policy discussions at the time. And as part of that, so we have this book series, and I'm speaking to the speakers for a minute. Think about this. We'll talk to you, see if you're interested in doing this. It's usually with Cambridge University Press. We're also thinking of trying to go with an ebook type format, perhaps through CEPR. But these get, they get pretty good distribution. It's a chance to put the things that we've covered, whatever the yearly themes are, together in one place. So again, speaking to the speakers, please think about this. And I think it's probably enough said. So we're glad you're here. I think that it's a really good program. I'll look forward to listening. And I will just shut up and let Petros, you're chairing this? Okay, or you're, I'm sorry, okay, so I'll stop now and Bernard and I will leave.
So one more thing before we start. You will have noticed it is not particularly cold here. We switched off the air conditioning systems I don't know, must have been actually at the beginning of the term, so exactly. So partly this is to green the EUI, partly it's to save money, but so my apologies for that. I think the good thing about people who showed up in a tie is that you can actually cool off a bit by taking it off at some point. Those of you who did not will just have to suffer. So outside, of course, it's going to be a lot nicer. So anyway, Iana, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Marion and Dominique, do you hear us? Good. Very excellent. Very good. Welcome, everyone, to this first plenary session of this big two-day event where I think we're in interesting times, so it's good to have an interesting conversation about where the trading system is going at the moment. Very briefly, to introduce myself, for those who don't know me, I'm Jana Dreyer, the founder and editor of borderlex.net, which is this news and analysis website on trade policy in Europe. Most importantly, it's the speakers on this panel that count today. This session will discuss a little bit how we can adapt the trading system to all the challenges that it is facing as non-economic objectives seem to be taking overhand. The session will be structured around this book here that is available online on the CPR website and also available here physically in Florence. That is co-authored by Petros Mavroidis, who probably needs no introduction to this audience, who is professor of law at Columbia University. Petros, you didn't write this alone. Almost. We have Bernard Hoekman, who also needs no introduction, who co-authored this, and Douglas Nelson as well, who's in the audience, who's professor of economics at Tulane University. So this will be, initial thoughts brought out there, and we have three very eminent panelists joining us to comment, contest, add new ideas. First with us today in person, Mercedes Araoz. Very nice to meet you. She's professor at Universidad del Pacífico. Her pedigree and CV is very impressive. She was, among others, a vice Prime Minister of Peru, and has served as economics and trade minister as well, and is an architect of quite a few of Peru's trade agreements. We have also online with us Dominique Njinkeo, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, who's from the African Economic Research Consortium at Southern Illinois University. And then we have Marion Jansen, who's probably doesn't need much introduction again in this audience, who is director of the Trade and Agriculture Directorate at the OECD. And I know Marion a lot from her work on subsidies, but I suppose you'll take a broader perspective as well. So I think it's going to be a fruitful discussion. I will let Petros present the book for about 20 minutes, and then I will open the floor to the other speakers to make about 5 minutes reflections, and then we'll have a conversation, including with the audience in person, and hopefully also as well online. Petros, the floor is yours.
Okay, but can we
Switch.
That's the paper. We have to put there.
It's not
No.
No?
But I can speak about this.
No, they told me it was this. It's not this one?
No.
No? Okay.
Sorry, there is a bit of a technical hitch. We'll be back.
We don't have any folder. It's not this one.
Arrivato where?
Madonna, non la vedevo.
We are getting there.
Yes.
Good. Thank you for your patience, especially the people who are online. It's always sometimes hard to follow what's going on. But we're getting there. Slides are being shared. Fantastic. Petros, over to you.
Bedankt. Where's Bernard?
He ran away.
Bernard, bedankt voor de uitnodiging. Hè? Zeer gewaardeerd. So the book is, this is the book. Doesn't work. So let me do this here. Doesn't work either. No. Ah, okay, okay.
Yes.
It's excellent. This is the book, but I mean, you see 3 names here, but there are a number of people to whom we are indebted, and one of them is present, Emma Bolunois, who is here, who was at Columbia University a year ago, and she participated in the research, and actually, this book would have been impossible if we could not count on excellent research assistants. Now, what is the argument of the book? So we started thinking about it because we witnessed this return to industrial policy, big time. And what is different this time, I mean, it's not totally different, I'll show you, but we haven't experienced it for centuries. It's industrial policy in the name of national security. Now, the WTO has gone through a number of crises, but the difference here is this crisis, there is no end in sight. And I'll explain why this is the case. Moreover, it comes at one of the worst possible, I mean, this is the lowest of the lows of the WTO. So this is the case, and on the other hand, what we observe is that the WTO is not capable to address this crisis. We cannot just set back the clock to 1995, it's impossible. So in our view, what needs to, on the one hand, you have an outdated law, especially with respect to national security, and an wanting institutional balance. So in our view, this is a case for damage control if we want to avoid further evisceration of the waning relevance of WTO. And Doug, Bernard, and myself, we do believe there is an argument for a WTO and a huge cost in case we go to a non-WTO scenario. So, as I said before, because we think it's a question for damage control, we're not in 1995. What we need to do is first remove some sensitive cases from the docket, cases which increase the distrust across the players, and rethink a little bit the current framework, because inertia would be decisive. So I'll do 3 things in the remaining 18.5 minutes. First, I'll explain the lay of the land, as we have it in the book, then why WTO cannot deal with the current situation, and then what, in our view, should be done. This is from the Dutch World Monitor, who had statistics from a number of very reliable statistics. Bernard preferred, for whatever reasons, the Dutch World Trade Monitor. So if you look, there are 2 dips. One is around the global financial crisis. The other one is during the pandemic. There is a recovery, and now it starts good. The slope is again downwards. What a number of people have called globalization. So, while the WTO seems to have recovered from the 2 previous crises, the WTO itself originally had an estimation that world trade would grow up to 2.7, it was more or less the case. 1.7 in 2003, they reduced it to 0.8 recently, and so on and so forth. One major reason is the increasing hostility between the US and China. What Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor called small yards with high fences. Now, the idea of small yards is we will not affect too much of the trade. True. High fences, of course, is we affect. But the small yards keep proliferating. They are mushrooming. The national security-based measures, for example, for critical goods, we see one after the other after the other. In the book, we cite the cases of a number of OECD members who come up with a new list of critical goods which should be under domestic production. And to cap it all, a couple of days ago, the US and the EU announced their new steel, their decision to go ahead with the new steel arrangement, which is another small yard with a very high fence. In an area you would expect there is no room for national security because everybody and his dog produces steel products. But still, even there you have a small yard with a high fence. Chad had a paper explaining that, well, yes, I mean, be careful here, it's, the small yards are really small. For example, semiconductors is a small yard, but if you look at the overall picture, trade between China is flourishing, fine, but then Caroline Freund and a few other co-authors came back with a new paper saying that China claims now 5% less of imports than it did in 2017. And this is the trend. Now, we spent some time thinking about how much was the WTO affected. We don't care very much about the trade. I showed you the picture. How much were the relations across WTO members affected because of the crisis? And we compare the global financial crisis with COVID and now what's going on here. I mean, during the global financial crisis, no matter how you describe the reaction, especially by the US and Europe, these are classic, and China, classic subsidies, and the subsidies regime makes no distinction between good and bad subsidies. They're all bad in the eyes of the WTO legislator. Still, when the global financial crisis happened, there was a perceived legitimacy of the reaction of the subsidies. We saw no cases. There is a great book by Chad, as an editor this time, 2011, going through all of this, and Simon even at his data. Is it still an issue? Not at all. COVID-19, same thing. Nobody put into question. Actually, I was quite disturbed by some of the European measures, some discriminatory export controls. But again, nobody put into question the European measures. Joost is late as always. And there was only one formal dispute, which was a very side issue between Turkey and the European Union. Again, not an issue anymore. But look at what's happening nowadays. You have this proliferation of industrial policy measures. The legitimacy is questioned, not questionable, questioned on a daily basis before the WTO. We have already 14 formal disputes, and I will give you numbers, that's exactly the work that Emma did, concerning how many actions are based on national security before the WTO committees in a moment. So this is where we are. We went back to Alexander Hamilton and Friedrich List, industrial policy in the name of national security. And what is the response here? So we have on the one hand subsidies, IRA in the US, semiconductors, Korea, Europe, Taiwan, China, everyone. Export restrictions, whatever members decide on what is a critical element. And if you look at the lists, we have a number of examples in the book. They are there is some overlap, but there is also a lot of heterogeneity. And you have one hand subsidies, on the other export restrictions. Now, there is this idea this might be sham invocations, fine. Let's leave it for now. What we observe is, until end of June 2023, 239 invocations of national security before the Committee on Market Access. Unprecedented number. You compare this with the GATT 70 years, you have something like 3 or 4 cases. 253 cases before the technical barriers to trade. And these numbers are definitely underreported. These are not the real numbers, because we have no notifications of subsidies. Now, subsidies, of course, are notoriously underreported. Why? Well, because if I say I have a subsidy, it's self-incriminating information. All subsidies are bad. But not even the IRA was notified. to the WTO, never mind the number of other subsidy schemes. So we have a number of market segmenting measures in the name of national security, which is a very strong signal. These measures, I will not take them back. Now, against this background, as I said before, people suspect sham invocation, sometimes for reason, sometimes for no reason. 14 formal disputes next to the hundreds of invocations. Russia won 100% of its cases, it's a paradox, and US won 8%, one of its 12 cases.
Can you expand on that? So you mean these are the Russia transit case?
Yeah. And the US, I'll have it in a moment, DS-558.
Okay.
But it's a very good point.
Yeah.
So, and this all happens with appellate body in abeyance. Now, this could be both a curse and a blessing. It's a curse because distrust grows. People win cases, that's the response to your question. It's a curse because distrust grows. So people win cases and nothing is implemented, distrust grows as a result. But it's also a blessing because can you imagine if you go all the way and you win the case, knowing now, and we know it, that there is never implementation. How many non-implemented reports will be sitting next to what we have already? So in a way, I mean, quite frankly, I mean, I don't know if the appellate body in abeyance for this particular issue is a curse. It's between the two. All losers have appealed into the void, all of them. US a few times. China, that's the case, the US won, appealed this case. Non-appealed case is Saudi Arabia, but they reached a political settlement wider with Qatar. It's not because of the WTO decision that they changed their policies. It was a totally different thing. So one thing is clear is when we go down the adjudication way, what we can observe until now is non-implementation of adverse reports. Because implementation would suggest, well, I got it wrong when I invoked national security. Who is prepared to say that? Now, why can the WTO deal with the current situation? Well, anyway, it cannot deal because of what I just mentioned, appeals into the void. But this is, we think, only, let's say, a fig leaf or an excuse not to go deeper. If you look into, I mentioned there are two instruments WTO members use par excellence, subsidies regime and export licensing. Subsidies and export licensing, sorry. If you look at the subsidies regime, it's totally outdated. I give you two examples, and I can give you many more, but two, let's say, obvious, flagrant examples. The first is cross-national subsidies cannot be countervailed. Now, they are as bad as national subsidies, but if China, for example, exports to Europe, subsidized goods, Europe can take countermeasures. But if China exports to Europe via, let's say, a subsidiary in Sao Paulo, to honor my dear friend Vera, then Europe can do nothing about it under WTO law, because Article 1 of the subsidies agreement was drafted in a way to avoid countervailing aid. Nobody thought of global value chains back in 1993 when the agreement was essentially drafted. There were no global value chains. They start a little bit later. So the framework of the agreement has nothing to do with today's reality. And then, of course, all subsidies are bad. One of, in 1996, one of the fourth or fifth paper we wrote with Bernard, if you remember, in DC, that was the question we were asking. Who drafted this agreement? How on earth did they have such a small exception for subsidies? Why didn't they copy the European solution? The presumption for some state aids being, there was no response. So that's the agreement on subsidies, which means that even if there are good arguments to subsidize, there are positive external effects for other sectors, you cannot do it in the WTO because the WTO so says. All subsidies are bad. Then you have the export licensing regime. You have a proliferation of export licensing, but you have absolutely no agreement on export licensing. All export licensing is considered a quantitative restriction. So the burden shifts right away to the member imposing it. And there is a paradox here. If it is import licensing, there is an agreement, and there is no shift of the burden of proof. And the shifting of the burden of proof matters in adjudication. If it is export license, for exactly the same reason, national security, there is no agreement. You have to explain yourself before the court. Finally, the GATT National Security Article 21. I mean, no matter how you read this clause, quite frankly, I mean, it's it is a different world, a different mindset. There was this paper by a security/international relations guy we cited in our book, Spikeman, 1938. He says, don't worry about war in the US, we have the reassuring presence of the Atlantic Ocean. Things will take time before they arrive in the US. Now you press one button and the missile is in your neighborhood. So none of this is part of Article 21. And the last thing I would personally, Bernard, of course, and Doug, the last thing we would like to see is leave it to adjudicators to update an agreement. It's not only a question of legitimacy, it's a question of a number of both type 1 and type 2 errors we have observed in the past. Now, institutional balance, why we said is wanting. I'll give you just one very simple response, and then we'll move into a little bit more to the nature of the adjudication process. Just think, what if respondents in the WTO consistently invoked the first paragraph of national security, which says, I don't have to divulge information which I think is contrary to my security interests. What would panels do then? Would they draw adverse inferences? My God. Not even the European Court of Justice did that in cases where it's a flagrant abuse of national security, Greece and the Macedonian name. Not even the Court of Justice of the European Union. Would the WTO panelists say, well, you don't give information, I think it is because you are in bad faith. Seriously? Just in a very simple way, you can cut off all the discussion about adjudication. Then there is this ongoing, in our view, futile discussion about justiciability and non-justiciability of Article 21. And if you look at GATT history, in our view, it cuts both ways. Because yes, their negotiating record does not suggest non-justiciability, that's clear. But in the very first case before the GATT, in the Czechoslovakia case, when Dana Wilgers, a Canadian statesman who was the head of the council, threatened to take the case to a panel, there was a vote, and actually 20 out of 21, only Czechoslovakia, the interested party, voted in favor of justiciability. Nobody wanted justiciability. I don't want to go into hypocrisy and stuff. A number of entities, I'm sorry for my EU friends, I have a Swiss passport so I can speak, I'm neutral. But the European Union in the Falkland case, I'm sorry, they went up, it's on record, we have it in the book, and they said it's non-justiciable. Now Europe says the opposite. The only entity which consistently is non-justiciable is the US. Everybody else, whenever they are respondents, they say non-justiciable. When they attack, justiciable. But let's leave this aside and think a little bit about the function of panels. I mean, if you have a national security concern, would you like to take this to a panel with ad hoc judges, with absence of expertise? And where do you find the expertise? I've seen a couple of papers by lawyers who say, oh no, we'll do what we do in SPS, we call experts. Where are those experts? In SPS, you call experts because you have UN agencies. Where are the UN agencies of national security? These are called NATO, before Warsaw Pact and so on. Who would accept a NATO expert in national security case involving a NATO and a non-NATO member? Suboptimal secrecy. The most advanced confidential treatment of confidential information, we checked, I think, all cases with business confidential and super business confidential information in the WTO, is Airbus Boeing. In Airbus Boeing, what they did, and now there is a book about it and we can speak openly, they had a room with access to a few people, where people would go, consult a computer, so you have to upload in the computer information, which you could not download. But who on earth would upload information in a WTO computer concerning intelligence? Are we serious? Never mind costliness of fair, because here the costliness of fair, it's not just for the losing part, it's for the institution. Can you imagine if a WTO says this is not national security and it was? Who will take WTO seriously? The list is endless. But this, we're not the kind of guys who say non-justiciability. We believe in scrutiny, but we don't believe in scrutiny by judges. So what should be done? And I stop, and I'm within my 20 minutes, no? Yeah? You're not upset with me, yeah? Okay. So first of all, the what not to do list. We believe in a legislative approach, not in an adjudicative approach. Legislation over adjudication here. We think adjudication is counterproductive. Remember what I said, law is outdated and it's totally incomplete as it is, and every time in the past I've seen WTO adjudicating bodies trying to complete the contract, it was a disaster. Look at the amicus curiae They have a very simple thing. I mean, the amicus curiae saga back in the 90s, it provoked a special session of the Council where everybody but the US and mildly Canada said this doesn't make sense. And you have no right to do those things. Look at the DSB minutes when the appellate body decided that the list of Article 14 benchmarks it's an open list, although the agreement says the exact opposite. Look at what happened following the case law public body and so on and so forth. And we don't think, I mean, for all these reasons that you should go to the adjudication. Moreover, you know that adverse reports will never be implemented, so why go down this route? Furthermore, it's the timing now. This is not the time for wrong cases to be submitted to the WTO, because all you'll do is you increase even more the distrust that exists. So what do? I'll say two things, and I'll leave more for our discussion later. What Joe Franco is with Bernard and Doug wrote the first paper, borrowing from our common friend Alan Winters' paper for the OECD, the theory of political economy and how you did for Alan Winters' first series, no? Yeah. So the idea is have some sort of a committee on national security, you can call it anything you wish, where you can have an informed discussion, you can borrow from specific trade concerns, discuss questions like what is your objective here, because national security means nothing. I mean, you involve different instruments depending on whether it is I want to preserve some sector for or I'm attacked by someone else. You won't use the same instrument every time. And discuss things like what is your objective, what are the means available, what else could be done, how can we mitigate the damage, how can we mitigate the external effects, and so on and so forth, in an effort to build back trust and see how the WTO can work and decide. By the way, the record of SDCs is quite positive. If you look, Bob Wolf has his paper on TBTs, he checked until 2020 the paper, but it's quite, I mean, it's 25 of the 28 years of the WTO. When you look at this paper, you see there's over 1,000 SDCs, and you have 57, I was looking this morning, TBT disputes, of which only less than 20 ended up in a panel. So it works, the system, it doesn't work. But of course, to do all this, we first have to overcome Charles Kindleberger's trap. Term coined by Joe Nye, which is when the hegemon fails to provide the public good. And what is the idea here? You have the one power that probably can, even with some help can do it, the US, but which doesn't want to do it. Doesn't want to do it both because it might feel upset by some panel reports, but also because trade policy is not a winner in domestic politics. There is the excellent account first of Mark Destler, and now there's a great book by Diane Mudge. They both point to the same direction. There is a very good reason why in the US, Democrats and Republicans have taken trade out of the agenda. There is a very good reason why Catherine Tai sounds more and more like the previous administration, speaking about worker-centered policies and so on and so forth. On the other hand, China, the second of the big two, the ascending power, lacks the soft power. China cannot persuade, even if it wants, it cannot persuade. It cannot rally the troops, have what we call in Canton de Vaud, where I live, le fait fédérateur. It's impossible for China. So, in our view, buckle up for more globalization. In the meantime, damage control is the best we can hope for, and I stop here.
Okay. Well, that's a very, uplifting way of starting this conference, isn't it? Low expectations. Let's increase expectations again, maybe. Mercedes, the floor is yours now. Obviously, non-economic objectives is national security. This has been the focus of this session. But there are many other non-economic objectives that are being pursued a little bit outside the WTO framework as well. Maybe you also have, reactions to this report, but also your own views on this general topic we're addressing today here.
Thank you very much, and really it's an excellent book. I really enjoy reading it. I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist, so I will be talking in terms of what we teach in economics when we teach international trade is be careful of what you ask to trade policy. because we're asking to trade policy to many things: national security, protection of the environment, labor protection, and you can imagine many other things. And it looks like in the 50s, when we were talking in South America, for example, about the issues on industrial policy, we were having this import substitution policy. It looks exactly the same, but now done by the big guys. When it's the big guys, they call it strategic policy, or we need to think about critical goods and things like that. But it's the same. It's the same story. It won't have good results for anybody, not even for the people that are applying the laws, the policy, and probably is the third best instead of the first best that we will have to look. So that's the problem of what we're going on right now, because, for example, I will talk, this is the issue of national security, but once you have this issue of national security involved, then you reduce products in the market for the rest. Those who are not in the conflict, for example, in the conflict between China and US, you will have products more expensive and with less possibilities. We saw that when we have these restrictions on trade that were all over the world because of COVID, but of course, we start seeing that cars weren't there anymore. If we wanted to import a car in Peru, we couldn't get it easily because there was reduction of the production because something happened with microchips or something like that. So we see the impacts that we have. I remember when we were talking these issues, we went from at least many of the countries of Latin America that we really got involved with free trade, and we were like the middle ground people talking about having more trade together. That was the issue. I was saying we want free trade because we want our products in the markets, but we want to import cheaper. This is part of the possibilities of medium-sized countries, emerging countries, to start being more industrialized, if we want. Otherwise, we will keep being the ones providing basic goods, and that's it. And we cannot do it if we don't have open markets. When we have open markets, there's a possibility to increase our industrialization. Otherwise, we are left out. And now what we are seeing is all these unilateral policies coming from many areas, like, for example, the issues on due diligence and deforestation from the European Union, that is hurting directly our possibilities of bringing out people from poverty, which is very delicate also. So we were like relatively successful in one industry or another, and then we are stopped in the middle. There is a lot of connection. If you buy a car, you probably need, this car from US probably is buying steel from some country in Asia, and that steel from Asia is coming from the iron in Peru. I mean, so for the mining production that we have, we are all interconnected. So these policies are reducing the possibilities of many countries, and that's what we're forgetting in this process, which is dangerous. And this book takes a lot of details on the issues on the spillover effects, which is a very interesting point, because once we have to create policy, we have to think not only in one particular area of interest, we have to think of the other areas of interest that we have in our policy making. And if we forget that, we start making damage to someone else. And probably that's the issue that we are not listening in this environment. That's why, for example, I will return to the issues on environment. Environment is a very interesting issue we have to address, but I don't know exactly how WTO can do it. Because we cannot get, we have all these COP meetings, and we don't have any result over there. And we expect that WTO will have an answer, a real answer, with protectionism. I don't know. That's hard. I don't think that that's the way. And probably if WTO works with other measures that are cooperation, I don't know, some kind of other open market, but with some kind of safeguards for protection of the forest or things like that would be good. For example, for the free trade agreement I signed, because I was a Minister of Trade at that time, with the US, we have a special amendment on the forestry. And we have a particular way to address it in which we improve our policies inside my country, but also we have cooperation for the improvement of the implementation of those policies to protect the forest. And I think at this moment, even though we have the new legislation on the European Union on deforestation, the part related with wood is not affected at all, because we have this kind of agreement for wood. The problem is with other products like coffee, cocoa, and others that are next to the forest, but that's another story. So look, that was in the FTA. What do we learn from that? It's like the Malaysia-Swiss cooperation on the palm oil. That's another interesting example of the cooperation that may come from a free trade agreement. And that could be improved if we go multilaterally, in which things of, okay, I will stop imports if your imports are not following some kind of certification process of quality, but not only quality, but also protecting some rights. But I would put a lot of effort and cooperation and money to this process of recovery. So that's something that we have to start addressing if you think particularly of emerging economies, because emerging economies are not in the process of the conflict, but maybe, because once you start getting more poverty in our countries, you will have people saying, okay, we don't want free trade. This is not the process that we want anymore. We have to develop in another way. And I'm seeing that in my country. We reduced poverty thanks to the possibility to be open to the markets, like from 60% to 20%. Now we are around 30%. Again, of course, we have COVID and all this stuff, but it's because of these restrictions. And the political side of this is that the people start protesting and people are populists coming. So we have to be very careful of what we do globally if we want to avoid having less democracy in our world, and to avoid less poverty, to have poverty also in our world. I think that will be my comments for the moment.
Thank you. Very, very important comments there. I think we don't think enough of it in the big capitals of the big rich countries about these spillover effects. Also very interesting proposals on how we could maybe mainstream a little bit some experiments that have evolved in bilateral processes. Dominique, over to you. What is your perspective on the book and also generally trade policy, non-economic objectives from where you stand from? Thank you.
Yes, good morning. What I think about the book, well, I'm glad to be involved in this discussion, to take from where Mercedes started. I am an African economist, so I look at the presentation. I've not read the book from an African perspective. From that perspective, I agree with many of the questions of the book, but I disagree with the substance of the book. The first is industrial policy in the interest of security. My understanding is basically that this is the book written in the interest of a security that is not the security of Africa. Because in Africa today,
it's not the security of Africa, he said.
When you think of security in Africa today, you think of, well, you look at what is happening in the Sahel. Mm-hmm. Are we undertaking any policy to address the issues that we are facing in the Sahel? Many people in Africa believe that the Sahel issues is Western problem exported to Africa. It's related to natural resource. Both what is happening in the DRC and in the Sahel, it's this security in the region is really and it related to natural resource. It's climate change, as Mercedes has said. It's migration. So basically, what I'm saying is that I didn't see from the book that whether the security that we have in mind here take into account the security as people face it from Africa, which is essentially something coming from outside, but which has a huge consequence for them. Then I would agree with Mercedes is that even with the book, the WTO really cannot deal with these issues. The question now is there any other body that can deal with the issue? Because from African perspective, it's not necessarily whether it's a WTO that deals with them or not. It's basically whether a solution is found. So probably I would say that maybe the book should raise the questions as it does, but also take into account the fact that maybe those issues that cannot properly handle within the WTO should be properly handled somewhere else. And basically that the global system should have a framework for addressing this security and the trade issues. Then what to do? I agree with the book that it's institutional reform, but which institutional reform? Okay, it's, I would say if it's an institutional reform that wants to include Africa or other developing and least developed countries, that's fine. But the book doesn't really get into that kind of discussion. In the end, it's really a matter of a global leadership to ensure then that the security that is discussed from a perspective of China, US, Europe, it's normal that they take into account the interests of Europeans, but it would also be interesting if we can see some world leadership appearing where those issues can be properly addressed. Because if you don't address these issues, whether we talk about migration, fair exploitation of natural resource or climate change, you seem to be addressing your own short-term security interests, but in the long term, you are creating problems, or you are not solving any problem, and then we will be back to this again. So I would basically say then that what we could do is to ensure then that we really take a longer term perspective, address those issues that can be properly addressed within the WTO. Definitely there is a need for reform of the WTO to be inclusive, but also to take to have a proper platform for the other non-economic arguments that the book is considering, including those that from African perspective are not considered, such that we create the space for a free trade to prosper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominique. That was very important, very strong, and I think that's something we hope the trade policy community will take on. I have a question for you now that I'm in there is, do you see, I mean, there's a lot of movement in Africa itself with regional integration and trade rules. You know, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area emerging. Is there something that from this experience you might want to put to the global system, to the WTO?
Well, of course, from Africa, our hope is then that whenever, for the next 10, 15 years, when the trade issues for Africa are discussed, it is from the framework of the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area, because basically it's definitely economic, but it's also a non-economic dimension, okay? Because for successful implementation of CFTA, if ECOWAS is almost disappearing because of what's happening in the Sahel, then it becomes a bit difficult to see how you will implement the CFTA. So definitely the non-economic issues that are discussed by the book are crucial for the implementation of the CFTA. It's crucial for Africa properly integrating the world trading system. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Marion, over to you. I think some newspaper referred to the OECD as the rich country think tank. It's an overstatement, but you have an overview from, you have access to a lot of data and are in the middle of all the politics of this. What's your perspective on the book, what's been said, and what proposals do you have to improve things? Thank you. In 5 minutes only, of course.
Thank you, Jana, and very pleased to be here with you today. I think Bernard said at the beginning that you have in the conference some people who are in the trenches. So when I listen to Pedro's, I definitely have the impression that he is describing my daily job. We are exposed to the themes that he has been referring to in his book, and it's this situation that he describes has been determining to a large extent our work over the past months and has been very influential for the design of the new and first ever trade strategy at the OECD. That strategy is called OECD Contributions to Open Markets and a Rules-Based International Trading System. And I would like to start by maybe emphasizing that this is a strong signal that the OECD still as has historically always been the case, stands for open markets and a rules-based international trading system. Also, thanks, Petros, for the reference to the secret room at the WTO for the Boeing and Airbus cases. I was one of the few people who had access to that room, and it was definitely a special way of working at that time. I'm going to start by making reference to the three important changes we consider that we're currently witnessing. One of them is the aspect of national security. I'm going to say a few things what I consider this means for economic researchers, trade economists, in terms of how we have to rethink what we are doing. And then I go back to what is more of a bigger theme in Petros's presentation, what this means for policy making, including at the WTO. Now, among the three things that are the big changes is indeed the theme of national security having become important and the need to find a new balance between an existing hegemon and an incoming hegemon. This means that we have to think about finding new balances in trade, between trade and strategic balances in a very different way. I think this has important implications for how we have to think about trade economics as a academic community. Second, we have also moved to from a world of trade and jobs or trade and environment to a world of worker-centered trade. So the worker comes first and trade comes second, or climate change and trade. So the emphasis is put among definitely many of our members at the OECD first on the sustainability objective and then on trade. That's very different from the time when I started my job some 25 years ago. And the third aspect that we find has changed a lot is the type of policies that are being used and that are affecting trade. And I would argue that a number of the new types of instruments, be it the CBAMs, be it the Forced Labor Acts, the CHIPS Acts, the IRA, or the new diligence guidance rules, they are policies that work through the supply chain and they are designed to work through the supply chains. Now, Bernard Hoekman had for many years been arguing that we should look at trade policies through the supply chain. Now we are thrown into that world where we have to do this, but in a way that we maybe didn't expect, not from the point of view of how can we liberalize along the supply chain, but from the point of view, how are potential trade barriers built into the system through the supply chain. So this is a challenge we look at here at the OECD along these three lines. What does this mean for economic thinking? Now, the national security aspect, in my view, means that we have to move a bit away from general equilibrium thinking and more towards game theoretic thinking. We're definitely currently in something like a tit-for-tat game, and we have to think about those prisoners' dilemma issues very seriously. We also have to think about that game theory is very much about big players that can hurt each other. And that changes also our view of thinking of how we can find equilibriums and what the role currently in this game is of the WTO. That's one aspect. When it comes to the and also the social objectives, we really have to reach out to that other community as the trade economists who work on labor, reach out to that labor economics community that works on trade, to the environmental community that works on trade, and let's find ways to work together. Those communities are still too disconnected. On the environmental side, we have to overcome one issue that we have not managed to overcome. Our models that look at regulatory problems, issues in a trade model are very different from the models that look at price-based instruments. We have to find a way to marry those instruments. And third, when it comes to the supply chains, there we have to start thinking supply chains indeed in our way of thinking economic effects. If you're going to ask me, how does a policy that works through the supply chain, how does, for instance, just a carbon footprint monitoring requirement in a supply chain, how is that going to affect trade? At this moment in time, I'm not even sure whether I have the models that would allow me to assess this. So a big agenda for the researchers in the room and a very new agenda. And I think that's maybe something positive, that new generation of trade economists, they really have interesting stuff to deal with. Now, let me come back to the policy making side. That was the side that Petros focused on. I would argue at what is the change for the policymaker. One important change in my view is that trade policymakers have to deal with other communities in a very different way, with other ministries, with other policymaking communities. The policies that Petros described, the policies that I just listed, have not been designed in trade ministries. They have been designed in environmental ministries, in the foreign affairs departments, in the industrial policy departments. They have an important impact on trade, but the trade ministers have not been in the driving seat for those policies. This is an important change. I remember times where any junior official from a trade ministry could go and see a senior official in an environment ministry, including the minister, and say, your environmental policy that you are trying to design is potentially trade distortive and therefore potentially in conflict with the WTO. And that was enough to stop the environmental ministry of acting. Nowadays, if a trade minister goes and sees an environment minister and says, the policy you are designing is potentially in conflict with the WTO, I bet that the environmental minister says, who cares? Yeah. That's an important change. That means that the trade policymakers have to deal very differently with the other communities, and that is, it will indeed demand an important diplomatic effort and a new way of interacting for that community. A second point, it's a point that Petros brought up. I fully agree with Petros that members should restrain from bringing wrong cases to the WTO. All these cases dealing with these new issues, just don't bring them now, because it's going to weaken a system that is already not very strong at this moment in time. It's not going to be helpful because you want to maintain that system. That system continues to be useful and will be very useful at the moment when the new hegemons have found a new way of dealing with each other. Don't bring the wrong cases. In this particular, on this aspect, I have a second concern. I would like to hear Petros' view on this. A number of these new laws being introduced in particular in the EU, but I think what's in the US, are being enforced through national tribunals. And I have the impression that a lot of the environment and trade agenda, for instance, is moving to national tribunals for enforcement, away from the multilateral trading systems enforcement mechanisms. I would consider this another weakening of the WTO in the making, but I look forward to reactions to this. Third point, so first point was deal with other communities, other ministries, don't take actions that weaken the WTO further. Third point, I have the impression that the current leadership of the WTO is pursuing a strategy of maintaining activity through small deals, so remain active, remain relevant until the big questions come back to the agency. I consider this a very smart strategy, and I do think the day will come where the big deals will come back to the WTO. I don't think it's tomorrow, nor the day after tomorrow, but this day will come. And the fourth point, I would advise trade policymakers, build the agenda for the future. That agenda will have to take policies along the supply chains into account, but that future will also require, and Petros made a bit of a reference to this, a new institutional setup around standard setting, notably standard setting for sustainability. When the SPS was designed, the Codex Alimentarius existed, ISO existed. References in the TBT and the Codex and in the SPS agreement could be made to in existing institutions around a lot of the environmental objectives. That kind of institutional setup does not exist, neither at national levels nor at the international level. That aspect has to be built, and I would encourage trade policy makers to support any moves in that direction. That kind of system has to be built, by the way, with the private sector. Last but not least, allow me to say a few words on our trade strategy at the OECD. We have taken these two important changes, the focus on resilience of supply chains, we call it, this focus of national security into account in our new trade strategy. We have been working a lot in the past months with our members on any kind of declination of the theme. Supply chain resilience, economic coercion, economic security is a new type of work for us that we try to do in a delicate way to maintain the trust of our membership. We do emphasize the need for more collaboration across borders and more collaboration of public sector with the private sector rather than less of both things in the type of work we do. And also internally, our work requires that we work more and more with other directorates and more across committees. And that allows us, for instance, to have the trade committee, which brings together trade ministry representatives to work with environment committee that brings together representatives of environment ministries to find ways to move forward together on these new types of agendas. So the whole thing is very challenging. We are at the OECD very actively working in this direction and try also to engage with non-OECD members in this regard. And to do this, we are building new collaborations, including with UN agencies, to work on resilient supply chains and sustainable supply chains, not only within the OECD, but also with countries outside the OECD. And I look forward to continue that discussion, notably with Dominic and with Mercedes. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. That was a very rich contribution, also with very concrete proposals as well there. We have about half an hour now to have a conversation. There's a lot that's been said. And maybe I'll give you the floor, Petros, for a while.
Let's give them the floor.
Do you want to bring in the audience immediately? Or maybe one of you, Mercedes, you want to react to what was said, or Dominic, and then we open the floor? No? Fine. Okay. Any initial reactions? We're all a bit overwhelmed, I think, at the moment. Okay.
Should we use the microphones here?
Yes, I don't know how that was. Okay. Joe Francois.
Okay, good.
Okay, can you please, because we have people outside, it could be good to have
clearly and loudly.
introduce your name.
I'm Joe Francois.
Yeah.
Not Joseph.
Joseph, according to... Just Joe, it's good enough.
Yeah.
And I'm also just an economist, like many of the others here. Though I'm a son of a lawyer, so that may help a bit. Way back when in the time when women's fashion involved shoulder pads and big hair and stuff, and I got my first job in Washington, and I was at the ITC, and we had a request for a study on trade and competitiveness. And I wandered into the Director of Economics office and said, what is this? Can you please define what it is? And he takes me aside basically and said, no, we don't want that. We don't want to really define what competitiveness is, right? Because it means different things for different people, but it means lots of studies and analysis and books and papers and things. I sort of get that feeling with security. I hear food security, I hear, I guess, national security, I hear operating an autarky, I hear supporting geopolitical objectives, I hear a bunch of different things, all of which are security. It'd be kind of nice to think about whether we have to define this before we get into talking about what it means. And then the second thing is just following up on Petros's worries about adjudicating stuff, right? We are seeing efforts for other non-economic, like labor market rules and stuff. We're seeing efforts to litigate this in regional agreements, right? WTO doesn't cover it, but they put some of this language in the regional agreement. So I'd like to hear some thought on that as well.
Okay, there was a gentleman at the front, and then Peter. You were there before. Yeah. Okay. Everyone's being.
Peter van den Bossen, WTI. I have well, there's so many things that one could react to. I have a question to Petros. He's not surprised that I have a question for him. You refer, one of your proposals is a committee on national security. Now, isn't that a bit of a fuite en avant? Because if members, WTO members, really wanted to do this, if there's a willingness to do this, they could bring it to many WTO committees. They could bring it to the General Council. So you don't see that happening, at least not enough and in seriousness. So how would such a committee on national security be of any help?
Thank you. And here is a. Yeah, I think I'm going to take 3 and then.
Vera Torstensen from Brazil, Getúlio Vargas. A question for Marion. Marion, nice to see you. First of all, congratulations for the book. I read it, it's very good. Marion, how about what we can do? We are living in a big crisis, a multilateral crisis in the sense of WTO, IMF, World Bank, all the institutions are in crisis. My question is, look, OECD is the secretariat of G20. What are you in the OECD doing to help this, the organization of this event? And look, one of the main issues is the reform of the multilateral organization. So we have to work on this, not only, and I think that you are too focused in WTO. We are all the time thinking about WTO. You have to think broadly, in the sense of put IMF, put the other institutions together and see abroad. Petrus, you are Hockman, you are the ones to do this. We have to think in the broad way. We have to think about IMF, World Bank, and the WTO together. Only trade is not going to lead us anyway. Marion, up for you.
Very good. All right. So I'll maybe perhaps leave the floor to you to respond to most of the questions, and then I'll open the floor to Mario and maybe also ask the others if they want to chip in. Petros.
Okay.
So, do we need to define national security?
I have it here.
You have it all. Yeah. So, good.
Je bent Zwitser, hè? Je bent voorzichtig, ja. Where's Joe? So that's the paper we did with Kamal. The first paper, we did a paper with Kamal, and we say national security is a concept which means different things to different people. And if you look at the word of Mona Pinches-Paulsen, which she went through all negotiating records, she didn't leave anything out. There were discussions about how should we, and they couldn't agree on what exactly is national security. So in our view, in the paper we did with Kamal, the idea is how do we disaggregate national security so we can understand which instrument serves which purpose and then start the discussion from there. This is half response already to Peter. This is something that never happens before panels. Never happened so far. There was no discussion. I'll come back into this point a little bit more. The second point is, I think, very interesting you made about FTA litigation. But in FTAs, these are different, they're much more complete contracts to start with. If you look at the language, for the kind of stuff we discuss, non-economic objectives, that's where I see, forget what I think. Michele Ruta's 2020 book for the World Bank, the deep trade areas. This is where you have the big deviation from WTO with respect to non-economic objectives. You mentioned before your environmental negotiations with the US. That's exactly, so the judge in an FTA context has much more of information in front of her, in front of him, to adjudicate the dispute. Still, I would not like to see national security myself being adjudicated, but that's a different story. But I think it's difficult to compare the two, WTO, FTA, in this respect. Actually, one reason why we did with Andrea our work on China was the way CPTPP addresses subsidies and state-owned enterprises and the way WTO does. And so there's the first thing that hit Andrea and myself was there was a chapter on state-owned enterprises there. And not even the word was included in the WTO SCM agreement, which is extremely paradoxical if you think about it, because the WTO agreement was being negotiated knowing that there is a China accession working party. Everybody in the room knew we're negotiating accession of China, and everybody in the room knew China has 60% of its economy at the time was SOEs. And still, they didn't put under public body to facilitate the work of the appellate body a footnote, by the way, SOEs are a public, end of the story. Nothing. So on Peter's point, I have two responses. The first is, you can take anything to the General Council. You don't need to have specific trade concerns in TBT. You can take it there. But there is a difference going to the General Council, where you have the ambassadors who have no technical knowledge and nothing, and a huge difference when you go to the TBT STC. Because there, every WTO member comes, if you look at one of the things when I did my work with Henrik and Erik Wikström of the WTO on this score, the first thing that hit me was the composition of TBT delegations. So we checked, you can imagine the usual suspects, but we got a number of developing countries who participate a lot, including Peru, in TBTs, because you had the sardines litigation. Now, if you look at Peru in the General Council, you have the Peruvian ambassador. But if you look at Peru negotiating the sardines issue with the amazing European legislation, sardine is not a sardine, my God. Anyway, talk about inventiveness in protectionism. So Peru goes there with all its WHO experts. So our point about committee national security is precisely this. You need to have the guys who understand the issue. You don't want to take these issues neither at the ambassador level nor to the panelist level. And ambassador, I have some time, but panelist, do you really want to think of a Stuxnet example? So I'm Israel, and I know Iran is preparing, let's assume they're both WTO members. I know they're preparing, they're enriching uranium, because Mossad told me so, and CIA confirmed, which is the real story. And I take action against Iran in trade. Do you want me to go there to a WTO panelist, which is, when you do typecasting, it's first appointment in Geneva of someone who has never been trained in anything WTO, 9 times out of 10. I did this work with Louise Johansson, and say, well, let me tell you about my national security problems with Iran. That's why it's a question of expertise and a question of what kind of questions you ask. That's why we believe in a committee.
But if I may...
Of course you may. You may and you do, actually.
Would a national security issue, which is very different in nature from a TPT or SPS issue, it's a highly political issue.
Yes.
Would that be an issue that members would allow to be discussed at the technical level of a committee? Would it not necessarily go to the General Council, so the ambassadors? I think there's a big difference between a TBT issue and a national security issue.
I agree, but the first step is exactly what Joe said. The first step is we have to understand what do we mean by national security, and that is not a political discussion. You have to explain to me what is the problem. So I have to understand why you use an appropriate or inappropriate tool. Anything is national security. In Sweden, in 1975, one of the cases we're discussing with Bernard and Doug, 1975, Sweden of all people, I'm not talking about now, Sweden says, I need to have a domestic shoe industry because the army needs to wear shoes if we go to war with Finland.
And everybody who has actually served as a foot soldier knows how important boots are.
That's what I said. You need some desegregation first.
Interesting. Let's leave that question there. I mean, we are now in a world where this is China, the US. This is not little Sweden, which you can laugh off a little bit. But I think it's a good question here. And there's been another proposal by Alan Wolf that's very controversial as well. On let's not litigate it, but let's allow countries to go ahead with a measure, but then they need to compensate or enter into sort of an Article 28 line.
We disagree with that, Bernard.
Okay, it's a very interesting conversation. But now let's go to the question posed to Mario, and I think it's indeed quite important. I mean, isn't this what we're witnessing, a more global crisis of global institutions and governance? And what can the OECD contribute here?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We definitely think that my personal feeling is definitely that we are at some kind of turning point, but that's a moment where we have to stand up, get our act together, and turn that turning point into the right direction. And that's definitely what we are trying to do here at OECD. I would like to make a point to this definition of national security and then go to the G7, G20 question. We have approached on the OECD side this issue of what are we actually dealing with in this context from a different point of view. We have the way we look at it was to say we are the trade committee, we deal with trade issues. The concern about national security or about meeting public objectives in general came through a supply chain lens. And we have been discussing mainly in the past years concerns that were raised by Petros through a supply chain lens under the heading resilient supply chains. And if you want to find out about our thinking, look for keys to resilient supply chains, OECD, and you find an online tool. And what we do in that online tool is we say, as a policymaker, you may have public policy concerns, legitimate policy objectives, as we would say in a WTO agreement, that could be national security, that could be public health, as under COVID-19. And you may be concerned that your supply chain doesn't deliver on that objective if you don't do anything. Now, how do you think this through? And what we do in that tool is to think through the supply chain like a risk management approach, like a supply chain manager would do, but from the policymaker's point of view. And we bring the policymaker in whenever the policymaker would think differently about the risk than the private sector actor would do. So we try to bring a market way of thinking into this process of how can I bring the trade aspects into my national security or national health thinking. By doing this, we avoid having to define national security. But we nevertheless try to help policymakers to think open markets, think supply chains, whilst they have these other policy objectives in mind. That's relevant for the G7, G20, this question of Vera, and good to see you, Vera. We are not the secretariat of the G20, nor of the G7, but we work like other agencies with the respective G7 or G20 presidents, and we very much look forward to work with the Brazilian presidency next year. We have worked a lot on resilient supply chains for the G7. Already under the UK, under Germany, you will find a reference to this in the G7 Leaders Declaration. And we have been doing that with Japan. Also, some of these documents are online. We work with the G7 also a lot on subsidies. Jana made reference to that work, partly because our membership thinks that finding a way forward on subsidies will be key in the future for the big powers, let's say China and United States and the European Union, to find a new equilibrium under the WTO heading. So we work on these topics, Vera, hoping to build a constructive agenda that helps members and ultimately all WTO members to find new consensus at the moment where they feel they can get ready to they are ready to discuss the difficult issues. We take a very pragmatic approach to the G20. Our membership, not all G20s are members of the OECD, so we are pragmatic and also humble. We accept to work on the themes that the G20 presidents thinks we can help them on. We were very proud that this year we were leading on the theme of digital infrastructure, and that was one of the few areas where the trade ministers could find an agreement on new principles. So this, we worked on the topics where the members think, G20 members think they can make progress, and under the Indian presidency, we feel that we have successfully supported the Indian presidency in the space they wanted us to work on. In general, our attitude is one of supporting all OECD members and all WTO members, and no, the OECD is not a rich man's club. Our membership is already very diverse, and we have accession negotiations going on with a country like Peru. We have Indonesia, who had expressed just before the summer interest in becoming an OECD member. With our members and with non-OECD members who want to work with us, we take a constructive approach. We are willing to take innovative, creative approaches to deal with what we consider a very new situation where we have to all to be very agile and constructive.
Thank you very much. Do one of the other panelists want to react to anything that has been said? Dominique? You don't have to, but I just wanted to make sure you get heard if you want to chip in.
No, I'm okay. I do want to underscore the need for thinking broadly and being inclusive going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, Mercedes.
Yeah. There's something I would like to ask, because what Petros and the team are presenting is we have to update WTO rules really in general. And given that we have this situation of ruling the supply chains, we have to start thinking also in trims, because I think in terms of the trade-related investment measures are very important. And we're seeing that now we are oriented the decision of investment with this issue of nearshoring or friendshoring, which is also security. And suddenly we were having, for example, in our case, we were having free trade agreements with everyone. So we want open markets and for trade and investment, both sides. And for example, in Peru, we're building a new port in which China is involved, and then suddenly everybody is looking at Peru and saying, oh, security, security, what's going on in Peru? We're going to have a port, and then the submarines coming from China will be settled there. And I say, wait, it's only an investment like any other one we have with US, with, the ports in our case, we have a European port, Maersk, we have another operator which is big from Dubai ports, and then Costco, which is another large operator. What's wrong with that, having an investment coming from China? But everybody's looking at us and say, okay, Peru is not our ally anymore. And that's dangerous, because we're really open trade. That's the thing I would like to ask. And the other thing is special and differential treatment, how it works in this kind of new world. That's the questions I will have.
Okay, let's leave it open. I don't know if Petros wants to react. We have 11 minutes for a final round of questions. I was asked by the organizers, anyone from the audience who wants to who asks a question, please go to one of the microphones. And same principle, name and affiliation, please.
Okay, yeah, good. My name is Sylvanus Kwaku Apesobo. I'm a Jean Monnet Fellow and an Associate Professor at University of Guelph, Canada. Yeah, my question is about how integrating the non-economic objectives or ensuring that trade policy is very compatible with these non-economic objectives. We know that this sometimes become very costly for developing countries, especially maybe those in Africa. You may not want to buy the cocoa from Ghana or the cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire because of what maybe labor standards and all of that. But as Dominic rightly pointed out, you may create another problem at your border, maybe migration crisis, because you don't want to buy the cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire or from Ghana. So my question is, what are developing countries doing so that in making sure that trade policy is compatible with these non-economic objectives, you don't unnecessarily maybe disadvantage developing countries? You rope them into it so that some of these policies would not necessarily disadvantage them. Yeah, thank you. So anybody can answer that.
Good. Is there a second remark here? Yeah.
My name is Ulrich Petersmann. I'm an emeritus professor here. And I think you all agreed that trade policy instruments are not a first best policy instrument for responding to many of these national security issues. And Dominic asked the questions, should we then not transfer the discussions from the WTO to other global bodies in order to deal with these problems more effectively? But I think you all agree that the reality is the Paris Agreement does not resolve the climate change issues. The UN security system does not resolve most of the security issues. So the reality is, I think, that due to the global rivalries, we have to resort to second best, plurilateral policy instruments. And here the problem is that the existing rules for second best policy instruments, for plurilateral agreements, are inadequate and insufficient. But I think here the starting point should be, and I think that's the question, that if the EU introduces unilaterally the CBAM, that can be justified, in my view as a lawyer, under Articles 2021 GATT. But of course it is insufficient. It's a unilateral European response to insufficient climate reduction, climate protection standards. So I think we need additional rules on plurilateral agreements, carbon clips, for example, and that's what the EU is now negotiating with India and with Arab countries and so far. And these plurilateral agreements must respond to the failures of the Paris Agreement. That is, the Paris Agreement nowhere defines what is common but differentiated responsibilities. The Paris Agreement nowhere sets sufficient incentives, financial incentives, financial assistance, technical assistance for developing countries to increase carbon reduction commitments. So I think this is just one example where plurilateral agreements are a necessary first step, but they are insufficient. So we need more inclusive responses. But we also have to acknowledge that plurilateral agreements simply cannot resolve many of these issues. Digital trade is one example. In digital trade, China pursues completely different values from the United States and from the EU. So in China, the private data belong to the Secret Service and to the Communist Party. In the United States, the private data belong to business. In Europe, we say private data belong to fundamental rights and individual consent. So these value conflicts cannot be overcome through plurilateral agreements, and here we have to accept regulatory competition will lead to a very antagonistic world, which we cannot avoid at the moment. And this antagonism has to play out until we find perhaps certain areas, e-commerce and the WTO, where we can limit these antagonisms.
Thank you very much. A lot of food for thought here. Petros, you want to react to some of that?
I can do it in 10 seconds because Silvanus, Bobish, you, me, and Mercedes will sit together over lunch and we'll discuss a paper by Patrick Lowe, SDT in today's world. For non-tariff concessions, that will be what Uli suggested. I think this should be WTF, Bernard, for next year. I mean, this is a huge topic.
Okay.
That will be 10 seconds.
It's very good, that's very efficient. Mercedes, do you want to react to any of that? No? Okay. Oh, I mean, I really wanted to react a little bit to Ulrich Peterson's remarks. I mean, I have the feeling that we are evolving towards a sort of neo-imperial kind of way of working, and I don't know how we can overcome this battle. I mean, when I read, for example, these proposals, let's create a national security committee, I mean, I think I have the same reaction as Peter van der Bosche here. It's like, okay, no, you're not going to bring them. No, it's not going to work. They're not going to sit down. I mean, the whole point is about not sitting down. It's the whole point. So I really wonder here if we shouldn't really be more looking towards mini deals, making sure that whatever comes in terms of constructiveness out of some bilateral settings. I mean, you mentioned the US one. The EU itself has its own constructive ways of dealing with deforestation, FLECT, and things like that. There is a beginning of a conversation in the EU about the consequences of everything. I mean, they're far away from having done anything very concrete. But there's a beginning of a conversation in Europe to say, okay, we're affecting our African partners, our Southeast Asian partners, our Latin American partners with this. Now there's, a dimension of financing infrastructure projects on critical raw materials, financing the change of energy source for a plant in Mozambique. So I was wondering, I mean, what is this world? I don't know if anyone wants to react. And in terms of the WTO, what can be done a bit more than just damage limitation? Does anyone else want to chip in on this issue? No? Yes, here's yours. Could you please come forward and same principle as before.
Professor Mavroidis, congratulations on the book. So the non-economic objectives
Could you please remind your name and your affiliation? Especially for the people online.
Yes, I'm Archana Negi, and I teach at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi.
Okay.
And I've been following also this debate within the WTO on non-economic objectives since many years. I was wondering if the book also addresses the issue of the manner in which the nature of the non-trade objectives have evolved. Because from 1995 to now, we see a big difference. And during COVID-19, this was a huge disruption. And all of the mini changes we make in trade policy is not going to work if we face big crises in the context of full disruptions. I believe one of the analogies was that the fuel tank of the ship of WTO was cut off during the COVID-19, similarly for climate crises, etc. So I'm wondering that if it's no longer just about saving turtles or saving shrimp, but about world trade coming to a screeching halt, should the WTO then, or can the WTO still afford to disengage with non-economic objectives? It was mentioned that a future agenda for the WTO must be set up. I think one of the questions there would be precisely this, that can the WTO afford to not look at? I'm not necessarily arguing that the rules of the WTO are best suited to address these issues, but to not think about the objectives would perhaps not be possible anymore. So that's my submission. Thank you.
10 seconds, and maybe Bernard, and then I'll let you wrap up with 20 sentences.
So let me just, on your question in terms of what do we do, how do we deal with it? Yeah. So I encourage everyone to read the book. There are copies there. Petros, in his inimitable way, has made it a bit more, let's say, on the tail of the distribution in terms of all the things that he says should be done. But I think where we need to go is exactly the type of work that Marion was describing that is being done at the OECD. And I think you have to start with much more analysis, information in terms of, okay, so we don't care what your objective is as long as you specify what it is, right? So that should be the first step. What are you trying to do? And then have a discussion, and this is not a negotiation, it's not that we're taking you to court. And this Committee on National Security, I think, is a very bad label for what we have in mind. It's really about having somewhere a forum, a focal point, a mechanism where technical people can actually explain to each other why they're using particular instruments to achieve a stated objective. So the burden should be tell each other what we're trying to do, what is our concern, and a lot of these concerns are shared. Right now, if it's about territorial expansion, that's obviously something that is not going to be shared. But it's a very small share of what is going on, right? And I think that's kind of missing. Now, can that be done in the WTO? Clearly, people are going to have very different perspectives on this. But again, what we show in the book, there's a huge amount of this going on in the TBT context, right? And these are technical people talking to each other and actually asking, why are you doing this if that is your objective? And that's part of a learning process. You can figure out how to do things better. But that's in a sense what we're arguing for. And what we also say in the book is there's a huge amount of this already going on inside the WTO. So it's not too much of a bridge too far to say, let's try and expand that. But it's all conditional on trust, right? So clearly there are big constraints, but I think that's the way forward. And I think it's also for Dominique in terms of saying, where are the African concerns? Right, so clearly if you rank order all the things that are going wrong and that need to be addressed, for Africa trade is pretty far down the list, right? But it can be part of the solution. And I think therefore, if you think about this, and there's a whole section in the book thinking about clubs of countries to actually think these things through, I think what I would recommend is that Africa become much more engaged in that process from the perspective of what do we need to do from an African perspective. And clearly the WTO is not going to be the solution, but again, having those mechanisms, platforms to have that discussion at least puts the thing on the table. And then you can think about supply chain analysis, the type of work the OECD does to say, okay, we actually have part of a solution here that collectively we should be thinking about. Thanks.
Okay, so we've reached the end of our time. It's 11:01, we're 1 minute late. Thank you very much. I think this was a fascinating discussion, fascinating, thought-provocative book, thought-provoking interventions, some very concrete proposals also on the way forward in a world that is difficult, but I think we have to build slowly and gradually. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those who are online. Thank you, Dominique. I think it's an untimely hour for you. And thank you, Marion. Good to see you online.